Now back in Spark in the glasses project, I noticed there's a lot of aliasing going on here. And I realized if we go to this glasses color object or texture, and it has a lot of alpha in it and it has a lot of small details. So if we change the sampling of the filtering type to, well, right now it's on none. If we change it to low, that's the default. But then medium, it'll smooth this out because it does a better job at kind of softening up these images. And I think high doesn't make much more of a difference, but it's maybe a little smoother. And these are more and more CPU intensive as you go down. So if you don't need it to be set to high, medium or low is always going to be a little bit better for performance. And it looks like medium does a pretty good job. It softens this up a lot compared to low, which just looks horrible. So we'll keep this at medium. Now let's grab the inner and outer elements that we just made. And because they're so simple, the file size is really small. So we don't even really need to compress these if we don't want to. Speaking of which, we should make sure no compression is on just so Spark doesn't compress it more than it needs to be. And for this, I'm just going to make 2 image planes in front of these glasses. And we'll use some exponential smoothing to basically lock it to the glasses, but not so much that it's just rigid. So these glasses are inside of the faceTracker, but because we want some delay, we'll need it to be outside of this faceTracker. And to make sure the coordinates are correct, I think we need to also be outside of the focal distance. So in camera, I'll make a plane and just confirm it's outside of this focal distance. We'll name this Fui Outer, Fui being a futuristic UI. And let's see where it put it. Okay, it's right at the origin. So if we take the actual glasses object, let's find some empty space here. We can drag this out. And there's a new feature in Spark called global coordinates, or global transform. And that'll give us the position, scale, and rotation of whatever object we put into it in a global space. So that means it's not localized to its parent, but it's globalized, so it's relative to the origin of the axis. So ideally, this position here is exactly where this is. So to test that out, let's grab this object and click the position dot and just plug it directly into here. Okay, it looks like it worked, but it's in a negative direction. So maybe we do need to have it inside of this focal distance. Now it looks like we're back at 0. Maybe let's try inside the faceTracker. Looks like that didn't work either. Let's try all the way out to the device. Okay, so it looks like that's the trick, which seems a bit strange to me, but we're taking the global position of this object, and I guess global position is outside of even the device. So if you're going to use this technique, the object needs to be completely out of the hierarchy, so there's no other transforms being applied. But with that, it appears to be in perfectly the right position. So now we can add some logic to this to make it delay a little bit. So we'll do the unpack and exponential smooth technique. And we have to unpack this each time because exponential smoothing only takes in one number at a time. There's no options to change down here. So we have to painstakingly do this every time we want to smooth a vector 3. And really, I should just make this an asset and keep it handy, but I know it's quick enough to make it every time. So now what we're doing is we're taking these transform position values, unpacking them, smoothing them out, packing them back together, and putting it into this plane. So now you can see this is following, but there's a little bit of a delay. It's definitely too swimmy, so let's make these values much smaller. And right now, this plane is directly centered on this point. And that would be fine, but it'd be nice if we could just move it freely and not have to have an add patch to add to this translation value. So instead, let's add a null object, and it automatically puts it deep in there. So we have to pull that out. And we'll name this fui. And instead of having the position here, let's grab the position and put it into this null. And then we can delete this one. So now this null is where we want everything to be. So if we put this inside the null, we're back to where we were. But now if we pause it, we can just move this and also move it forward. So the null is still tracked and still in place over here, but this fui is now easily movable. And it still tracks because its parent is still tracking properly. Now let's make the material for this. We'll go to the materials, create new material, double click this to rename. Mat fui, let's do outer first. We'll make it flat. Grab the texture for it, and it'll be fui outer. And it looks like we're looking at the rear face of this, so we can just change the cull mode to front. And then we can scale this up. And obviously it's not centered, so we can just kind of eyeball it. So now it looks like it's pretty well centered. But as you can see, when my head moves around, it's tracking, but it's not rotating properly. So we also need to grab the global rotation. And maybe we don't need to smooth this out, so let's try without smoothing first. And we'll just plug this directly in. And it looks like it spun it around. So we can actually change the cull mode back to back. And because it rotated, we also need to reposition this. And if you wanted a better frame of reference, you can make a face mesh here, just so you can see where the face is in 3D space, because obviously you can't see anything here. But I'm not worried about being a perfectionist here, so I'm just kind of fitting it right on there, just by looking at it. So now you can see it's following my head rotation and my head position, but the position is a little bit smooth with these exponential smoothing. And so it just makes it a little floatier, a little more holographic, and obviously not as rigid. And I think that's looking pretty cool already. For both of these textures though, there's a fair amount of aliasing going on. So if we turn up the filtering to medium, it looks like that's a lot better. Let's see if high is any different. It might be, but I think medium looks the same. So now we can just duplicate this by hitting Control D, and we'll rename this inner. And all we have to do is duplicate this material and then rename it again. And then in the texture, we'll just change it to inner. And then we'll just go back to the object and switch the material to inner. So now I have this inner element as well. And as planned, we want to scoot this forward just so we have some parallax here. So now as I rotate my head, you should get this nice parallax look. It's very Iron Man, if you're familiar with that motion graphics craze from many years ago. And I think this looks really cool. If we want to take the animation a little bit further, we can duplicate this setup and then remove the outer from this one and the inner from this one, or vice versa. Actually, I want the outer to be in the one we already made, and the inner to be in the new one. And for the inner one, I want the delay to be a little bit smoother and slower. So I need to reconnect this position. And to make it smoother, I'll duplicate this setup. And I'll change the damping to 100 on each of these. And we also need to connect the rotation. So click the dot there, and then we'll just drag in the same rotation. So now these nulls are basically doing the same thing. This inner null, though, is just a little bit smoother. So now we should see a little bit more overlapping motion once I rotate my head. Yeah, so it looks like it's almost tracking what's in front of you a little bit more because there's a little bit of a delay, and it just adds that much more texture. And the beauty of starting with a white texture for UI is that if you go into the materials and click on color, you can tint it just by changing this color a little bit. So if we just turn up the blue, we could have it match the visor or the goggles a little bit more, or we could keep it quite bright. Just have maybe a very subtle tint there. And for the inner one, maybe we go a little bit redder. Just have a little color contrast in there. Maybe it's a little too close to my skin tone, so maybe like a greenish or a teal would look nice. Or just keep it white. So that's as far as we're going to take the UI part of this, but if you wanted to make this more complex, you could break this texture into even more pieces and then animate the rotation or scale of those independently. So you could animate this whole thing on and off, or have things kind of jittering back and forth as if it's scanning. There's a lot you could do with this technique, but this is just kind of a nice groundwork to get you going.